My sister owes $750,000, my mom said, slamming a bank statement onto the dining room table. If you do not pay it by Monday, you are out of this family forever. I stared at her, then looked at my sister and replied, "Then I am out." That night I contacted my legal team. 2 days later, I received 66 missed calls from my family. I did not answer any of them. I just sent a simple text that read, "Too late. My name is Sydney. I am 33 years old and a private wealth manager at a top investment fund in Chicago. Before I tell you exactly how I legally dismantled my toxic family in 48 hours, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off the people who were supposed to love you the most." Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, our family projected an image of absolute perfection. My parents, Richard and Linda, lived in a massive 6-bedroom estate in Lake Forest. From the outside, with its manicured lawns and expensive cars in the driveway, we looked like the ultimate American dream. But inside those walls, the reality was a suffocating hierarchy where I was always at the bottom. The evening that ended my relationship with my family began on a freezing Friday in November. I had driven out to the suburbs for what was supposed to be a standard family dinner. I had just closed a massive portfolio deal at work and was looking forward to a quiet weekend. I should have known better. The moment I walked through the heavy oak front doors, I could feel the tension radiating through the house. The usual smell of expensive catering was absent. Instead, my parents were standing rigidly in the formal dining room waiting for me. My 30-year-old younger sister Chelsea was sitting at the long mahogany table inspecting her freshly manicured nails. Sitting right next to her was her husband Jason, swirling a glass of imported Italian wine like he owned the place. I barely had time to take off my wool coat before my mother marched over to the table. She did not say hello. She did not ask about my day. She simply picked up a thick manila folder and threw it down right where I usually sat. The bold logo of a major national bank was printed on the front. "I need you to handle this immediately," Linda demanded, her voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute entitlement. "Chelsea is having some minor cash flow issues with her wellness brand, and the bank is threatening to take aggressive action." I slowly walked over to the table and looked down at the documents. The numbers printed on the summary page made my blood run cold. It was not a minor cash flow issue. It was a massive default. My sister owed exactly $750,000. For the past 3 years, Chelsea had been playing the role of a successful entrepreneur. She had started a wellness and lifestyle brand selling overpriced crystal-infused water bottles, generic vitamin supplements, and toxic positivity on social media. My parents funded her initial launch, bragging to all their country club friends about their youngest daughter, the brilliant CEO. Meanwhile, Chelsea spent her days posting photos from first-class flights to Bali and staying in 5-star resorts pretending it was all business expenses. Now the reality of her terrible financial management was staring me right in the face. I looked up from the folder and met my mother's gaze. "This is a severe default," I said, keeping my voice completely professional and devoid of emotion. "What does Chelsea's business debt have to do with me?" Linda crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin defiantly. "I already spoke with the bank manager this afternoon. I told them that your investment fund will be stepping in to clear the entire balance by Monday morning. I gave them your corporate contact information so they can send you the wire transfer details." The sheer audacity of her statement echoed in the quiet dining room. She had not asked for my help. She had promised nearly $1 million of my money, or worse, my firm's money, to cover my sister's catastrophic failures. Jason suddenly scoffed, taking another sip of his wine. "Come on, Sydney," he said, leaning back in his chair with an arrogant smirk. "You are a senior wealth manager. $750,000 is just pocket change for you. If Chelsea's company goes bankrupt, the bank is going to come after our house. You cannot just sit there in your designer suit and let your sister become homeless." I stood there looking at these people, and a wave of memories from 10 years ago suddenly rushed back to me. I was 23 years old, smelling like stale coffee and fryer grease, after working a grueling double shift at a downtown diner. I was working myself to the bone just to make the minimum payments on my heavy student loans, trying to survive while studying for my financial licensing exams. I remembered coming home to this exact house one evening, utterly exhausted, only to find a brand new luxury car sitting in the driveway with a giant red bow on the hood. My parents had bought Chelsea a $70,000 car simply because she had managed to pass her college finals with a mediocre C average. When I had asked my father for a small $2,000 loan to cover my advanced certification textbooks that same month, he had looked me in the eye and told me that financial struggle builds character. He said I needed to learn how the real world works. Apparently, building character was a requirement reserved exclusively for me, while Chelsea and her freeloading husband were handed the world on a silver platter. I pushed the manila folder away from me. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of Chelsea's wine glass. "I am not paying a single cent of this debt," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I am a private wealth manager. I do not throw money at failing vanity projects, and I certainly do not reward financial incompetence." Chelsea finally looked up, her face twisting into an ugly scowl. "You have millions of dollars sitting in your accounts," she snapped, sounding like a spoiled teenager rather than a 30-year-old woman. "You are just jealous because my brand has thousands of followers and you just sit in a boring office all day looking at spreadsheets." I almost laughed. "I sit in a boring office, generating actual wealth," I replied. "You sit on a beach taking selfies while burning through borrowed cash. You played a dangerous game, Chelsea, and you lost. You are bankrupt." My mother slammed her hands on the table, her face turning a deep shade of red. "How dare you speak to your sister that way?" Linda screamed. "She made a few minor miscalculations. The market is tough right now. You are her older sister, and you have more than enough resources to fix this. Families protect each other. You are going to authorize that wire transfer on Monday morning, and we are going to put this ugly mess behind us." I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clarity. "No, I will not. My firm is not your personal piggy bank, and my personal wealth is none of your business. I am going home." I turned to walk toward the door, but my father, Richard, finally stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, blocking my path. His face was rigid with anger, and his fists were clenched at his sides. He was about to deliver an ultimatum, completely unaware that his words were about to trigger a chain of events that would legally and financially destroy his entire life. Jason stepped away from the dining table, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. He walked over to stand beside my father, crossing his arms and looking at me with a mixture of disgust and absolute entitlement. "You are completely cold-blooded, Sydney," Jason sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You sit up there in your downtown penthouse, hoarding your cash, and you do not care about anyone but yourself. You have zero human empathy. You are a private wealth manager, for crying out loud. $750,000 is literally pocket change for you and your rich clients. But for us, it is everything." I stared at Jason. This was a man who had not held a legitimate job in half a decade. He called himself a brand consultant for Chelsea, which was just a fancy title for a guy who carried her shopping bags and drove the luxury SUV she bought with borrowed funds. Now he was trying to lecture me about human empathy and hard work. "If Chelsea's company goes bankrupt, we lose the house," Jason continued, raising his voice to ensure the entire room felt the weight of his dramatic revelation. "We will be out on the street. Your own sister will be homeless. Is that what you want? Do you want to see us lose our home just so you can keep hoarding your massive bonuses?" Before I could even respond to his ridiculous accusation, the theatrical performance truly began. Chelsea buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, dramatic sob. Her shoulders shook as she forced out fake tears, playing the ultimate victim. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times since we were children. Whenever she broke a rule, ruined my belongings, or failed a class, she would produce these exact same tears, and my parents would immediately rush to console her while punishing me for upsetting her. "I was just trying to build a legacy for us," Chelsea wailed between forced sobs. "I wanted to create a brand that would make this family proud. I worked so hard on my wellness company, and the market just turned against me. I did not mean for any of this to happen. I am drowning, Sydney. Why will you not just help me? My mother practically sprinted across the dining room. Linda wrapped her arms tightly around Chelsea, pulling her youngest daughter into a fierce hug while glaring daggers at me over Chelsea's shoulder. Shush, sweetheart, it is going to be okay, Linda cooed softly to her, stroking her hair. Then Linda turned her venomous gaze fully onto me. You are enjoying this, are you not? My mother spat, her voice laced with pure poison. You have always been jealous of her. From the time you were little girls, you could never stand the fact that everyone naturally loved Chelsea more. And now that she has built a beautiful life, you want to see it destroyed. Jealous, I asked, my voice dangerously even. You think I am jealous of a failing company and a mountain of debt. You are jealous because she has a happy family, and you have absolutely nothing but your spreadsheets and your bank accounts, Linda shouted. Look at her. She has a devoted husband who stands by her side. She has a gorgeous home. She has a life filled with love. And what do you have, Sydney? You are 33 years old and completely alone. You have no husband. You have no children. You spend your weekends working because no man wants to deal with a woman who acts like a calculating machine. You are punishing your sister because she has the perfect marriage and the beautiful life that you secretly crave. The audacity of her statement was staggering. My mother was standing in a house paid for by Richard's dwindling retirement funds, comforting a daughter who was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and praising a son-in-law who was a literal parasite. Yet in their twisted reality, I was the miserable failure simply because I was unmarried and refused to finance their delusions. My father nodded in agreement, pointing an accusatory finger at me. Your mother is right, Richard added, his voice booming with forced authority. You have always been bitter. When Chelsea got married, you sat at the reception looking miserable. When she bought her house, you criticized the mortgage rate instead of congratulating her. You cannot stand to see her happy. This is your twisted way of getting back at her for having the perfect life you could never achieve. If you let her business fail, you are proving to everyone exactly how vindictive and lonely you truly are. I looked at the four of them standing together, a unified front of delusion. They genuinely believed their own lies. They believed that Jason, a man wearing a luxury watch bought on credit, was a prize. They believed Chelsea's fraudulent lifestyle brand was a grand legacy. They believed that manipulating me into paying their debts was not only justified, but a moral obligation to cure my supposed jealousy. The psychological abuse was so familiar, so deeply ingrained in the fabric of this family, that a younger version of me might have broken down. A younger Sydney might have written the check just to buy their love, just to prove I was not a bitter, jealous spinster. I had spent my entire childhood trying to earn a fraction of the affection they showered on Chelsea. I had graduated at the top of my class, secured a highly competitive internship, and climbed the corporate ladder at one of the most ruthless wealth management firms in Chicago. I had done everything perfectly. But to them, I was just a walking checkbook, only valuable when I was funding the golden child's fantasy life. Let me get this completely straight, I said, maintaining absolute eye contact with my father. You are demanding that I liquidate my hard-earned assets to save Jason's house. You are telling me that paying off nearly $1 million of toxic debt is the only way to prove I am not a jealous, lonely woman. You want me to reward Chelsea for running her company straight into the ground. It is not a reward, it is family duty, Jason snapped back. You have the liquidity. You wire the funds, we clear the bank default, and everyone moves on. Chelsea can rebrand her company next quarter and start fresh. You will not even miss the money, Sydney. Stop acting like we are asking you to cut off an arm. I watched Chelsea peek through her fingers, her fake crying pausing just long enough to gauge my reaction. She was waiting for me to cave. She was waiting for the guilt trip to work, just like it always did when we were kids. I took a slow, deep breath, surveying the dining room that felt more like an interrogation chamber. The crystal chandelier above us cast a bright light on the absolute absurdity of the situation. They were not asking for a favor. They were attempting a financial hostage situation using my marital status and emotional boundaries as weapons. Linda stepped closer. her tone shifting from aggressive to a sickeningly sweet manipulation. "Sydney, be reasonable," she pleaded, though her eyes remained cold. "If you do this, Chelsea will be so grateful. We will all be so grateful. We can finally be the close, loving family we are supposed to be. You do not have to be so isolated anymore. Just pay the bank and we can all go back to being happy." The condition of their love had never been stated so explicitly. Pay the ransom and you get a seat at the table. Keep your money and you are the bitter, jealous outcast. They were holding my place in the family hostage for $750,000. Richard stepped forward, his face hardening into a mask of absolute authority. He had watched my mother and Jason fail to break my resolve, and now he was bringing out the heavy artillery. He slammed his hand flat against the dining room table, causing the crystal wine glasses to rattle violently. "Listen to me very carefully, Sydney," Richard warned, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You are not going to disrespect this family and walk out that door. We are giving you a choice, and it is the absolute last choice you will ever make in this house." He pointed a rigid finger at my face, utilizing the same intimidation tactics he used on his subordinates at work. "Either you authorize that wire transfer for $750,000 by Monday morning to save your sister, or you are out. I will contact my attorney first thing on Monday and have you permanently removed from my will. You will be stripped of your inheritance. You will not be welcome at holidays, you will not be welcome at our funerals, and you will no longer be considered my daughter. If you refuse to protect your own flesh and blood when they need you the most, you are dead to us." He stood there, his chest puffed out, fully expecting the threat of disinheritance to force me to my knees. In his mind, the promise of future wealth was the ultimate leash. He thought I was playing a game of chicken, assuming I would never risk losing my slice of the family estate. He genuinely believed that throwing away his love and his money was a consequence I could not survive. What Richard failed to understand was that I managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars for a living. I knew exactly how to calculate a return on investment. And the emotional, financial, and psychological return on this family was entirely bankrupt. The inheritance he was dangling over my head was completely worthless compared to the peace of mind I would gain by cutting them off. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at the man who had spent his entire life treating me like a second-class citizen, picked up my tailored wool coat from the back of the chair, and slipped it on. "Then I am out," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any hesitation. The silence in the room was deafening. Chelsea actually stopped her fake sobbing, her mouth dropping open in genuine shock. Jason blinked rapidly, completely failing to comprehend that his free ride had just evaporated into thin air. My mother gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if I had physically struck her across the face. "Sydney, get back here right now!" Richard barked, his voice cracking with sudden panic as I turned my back on them. "If you walk out that door, do not ever come back." I did not even break my stride. I walked down the grand hallway, my heels echoing sharply against the imported marble floor. I reached the heavy oak front door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the freezing November night. I pulled the door shut behind me with a solid, definitive click. The crisp Chicago air hit my face, and for the first time in 33 years, my chest felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating weight of trying to earn their impossible approval was gone. I was finally free from the toxic circus they called a family. I walked briskly down the long, sweeping driveway toward my car. The wind whipped through the bare trees, but I felt a strange warmth spreading through my veins. Let them keep their twisted dynamic. Let them lose their house. I was walking away, and I was never looking back. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, letting out a long, slow exhale. I reached for the ignition, ready to drive back to the city and block their phone numbers for good. Right at that exact second, my phone buzzed violently in my coat pocket. I paused. I fully expected it to be a frantic text message from my mother, threatening me with more guilt, or an angry voicemail from Jason demanding I turn the car around. I pulled the phone out and looked at the glowing screen. It was not a text from my family. It was a high-priority push notification from my premium credit monitoring service. As a licensed financial professional, I kept my credit locked down tightly, utilizing a service that alerted me the second any suspicious activity hit my social security number. The bold red text on the screen read, "Urgent credit alert. Severe delinquency reported." My brow furrowed in confusion. I paid every single credit card in full each month. I had no outstanding personal loans. I opened the secure application authenticating my identity with my face scan and waited for the detailed report to load. The screen refreshed, and the blood instantly drained from my face. My heart slammed against my ribs like a jackhammer. There, glaring at me in stark black and white, was an active commercial mortgage loan. The principal amount was $250,000. The status was marked as 90 days past due, entering default. The loan was attached directly to my personal social security number. The origination date was listed as 14 months ago, and the business name tied to the collateral was none other than Chelsea's Wellness brand. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, the freezing air outside my car completely forgotten. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place, forming a picture so horrifying it made me physically nauseous. They had not just invited me to dinner to beg for a bailout. They had not just asked me to voluntarily clear Chelsea's business debt to save Jason's house out of the goodness of my heart. 14 months ago, my own parents had stolen my social security number, likely digging through old tax documents they kept from when I was a college student. They had forged my signature. They had illegally listed me as the primary financial guarantor for a $250,000 commercial loan to fund Chelsea's fake entrepreneurial lifestyle. And now that the loan was imploding, the bank was not just going to foreclose on Jason's house. The bank was coming directly after me. If a $250,000 commercial default hit my permanent financial record, I would immediately be flagged by the federal regulatory authorities. I would lose my job at the investment fund. I would be stripped of my wealth management licenses. My entire career, the life I had built from absolute scratch with my own two hands, would be completely annihilated. They did not just want my money. They had stolen my identity. They had committed a massive federal crime, and they had intended to use guilt and family loyalty tonight to force me into paying off the very debt they had fraudulently taken out in my name. They were trying to make me pay for a crime they committed against me. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The sadness and relief I had felt just 2 minutes ago completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and lethal rage. Richard and Linda thought they could manipulate me into submission. They thought I would quietly empty my accounts to protect the family name and avoid their petty drama. They had absolutely no idea that they had just initiated a war with a woman who understood the federal financial legal system better than anyone else in the city of Chicago. I put the car in drive. I was not just going to walk away anymore. I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. Monday morning arrived with a biting wind that whipped off Lake Michigan, but the freezing cold outside was absolutely nothing compared to the ice running through my veins. At exactly 8 in the morning, I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the commercial banking headquarters in downtown Chicago. I was wearing my sharpest tailored suit, my expression locked into an unreadable mask of pure determination. Walking right beside me was David. He was a corporate litigator who specialized in white-collar financial fraud. And more importantly, he was a ruthless shark who did not ever lose a case. We bypassed the main lobby and took the private elevator straight to the executive commercial lending floor. The regional loan director, a balding man named Gregory, was waiting for us in a glass-walled conference room. He wore a practiced customer service smile, clearly assuming this was just a routine meeting, where a wealthy older sister would graciously write a massive check to bail out her struggling sibling. He had absolutely no idea what kind of hurricane had just walked into his office. I did not even bother to sit down. I dropped my leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany table and looked Gregory dead in the eye. "I want the complete origination file for the commercial loan tied to my social security number," I demanded, my voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "I want every single piece of paper, every signature page, and every piece of identifying documentation used to approve that $250,000 credit line. Gregory blinked, his practiced smile faltering slightly at my aggressive tone. He fumbled with a thick manila folder on his desk and slid it across the table toward me. David and I opened the folder together. The room fell dead silent as I rapidly flipped through the pages. There it was, the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal laid out in black ink. The primary borrower was listed as Chelsea's Wellness Company, but right below it, listed as the primary financial guarantor, was my full legal name, my date of birth, and my private social security number. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the contract. It was an incredibly sloppy forgery of my handwriting. I kept flipping through the supporting documents, and a sickening wave of realization washed over me as I saw exactly what they had used to verify my identity. They had submitted copies of my old tax returns and W-2 forms from over a decade ago. These were incredibly sensitive documents from when I briefly lived at their house during my early college years. My parents had deliberately dug through their basement storage, retrieved my financial records, and handed them over to the bank to secure a massive commercial loan for Chelsea. They had orchestrated this entire fraudulent scheme 14 months ago. For over a year, I had been legally tethered to a sinking ship, completely unaware that $250,000 bomb was strapped directly to my financial record. My hands started to shake, not out of sadness or panic, but out of a profound, blinding rage. If this loan went into a hard default, it would not just damage my credit score. It would trigger an automatic mandatory review by the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. I hold Series 7 and Series 66 federal licenses. Those credentials are the absolute lifeblood of my career as a private wealth manager. If a massive commercial default hits my public record, my firm is legally required to terminate my employment immediately. I would be permanently stripped of my licenses and banned from the industry. I looked down at the forged signature, remembering exactly what it took to earn those credentials. I remembered sitting in a freezing, cramped studio apartment for 2 straight years, surviving on cheap noodles and black coffee, while memorizing thousands of pages of complex financial regulations. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and my entire social life to pass those grueling exams on the first try. I built an entire empire from absolute scratch. While I was pulling all-nighters to secure my future, my parents were busy mocking my ambition and funding Chelsea's luxury vacations. Now, the very people who contributed absolutely nothing to my success were willing to permanently destroy it just to maintain their golden child's fake lifestyle. They were willing to sacrifice my entire career to save Jason and Chelsea from having to face reality and get real jobs. Gregory cleared his throat, attempting to break the heavy silence in the room. "Look, Sydney," he started, using a patronizing, overly familiar tone. "I spoke with your mother Linda last Friday afternoon. She assured me this was just a temporary family cash flow issue. She explicitly promised that your investment fund would be transferring the full balance today to settle the account and avoid foreclosure on the collateral properties. I am sure we can just process the payment right now and clear this whole misunderstanding up." David stepped forward before I could even open my mouth. He placed his hands flat on the table, leaning in dangerously close to the loan director. "You are not processing a single payment from my client," David stated, his voice sharp and authoritative. "What you are looking at is not a family misunderstanding. What you are holding in your hands is documented evidence of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. My client did not authorize this loan. My client did not sign these documents." Gregory's face lost all of its color in an instant. He suddenly realized the massive liability sitting on his desk. The bank had completely failed to properly verify the identity of a guarantor for a $250,000 loan. I finally spoke, my voice dripping with absolute venom. "My parents stole my identity," I said, looking right through the terrified bank director. "They forged my signature to fund a fraudulent wellness company that sells snake oil. If you attempt to initiate any automatic withdrawals from my accounts, or if you report this fraudulent default to the credit bureaus, my legal team will hold this institution fully liable for catastrophic professional damages." I snapped the folder shut and slid it back across the table. I am not bailing them out, I told Gregory, delivering the final verdict. I am initiating a full federal investigation. I expect your legal department to cooperate fully when the authorities arrive to subpoena these forged documents. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room, leaving the terrified bank executive staring at the explosive legal disaster my parents had just dumped on his desk. The countdown had officially begun, and I was going to ensure my family faced every single consequence of their actions. Stepping out of the bank and into the biting Chicago wind, I felt a dangerous level of clarity. The initial shock of the identity theft had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold and calculated focus. I turned to David before we even reached his car. I told him I needed to know exactly where that $250,000 went, and I needed to know what the other $500,000 of that massive debt consisted of. I authorized him to immediately hire the most ruthless forensic accountant and private investigator in the city. I wanted Chelsea's entire business model dissected down to the very last penny. By 4 o'clock that same Monday afternoon, we were sitting in a highly secure conference room at David's law firm. Across the table sat Carter, a veteran financial investigator who specialized in uncovering corporate fraud. He did not waste any time with pleasantries. He opened a thick binder and spread a series of highlighted bank statements, tax filings, and corporate registration documents across the glass table. Carter looked at me with a grim expression and stated that my sister's wellness company was a complete phantom. There was absolutely zero legitimate business activity. I leaned forward, analyzing the spreadsheets. I asked him to clarify if he meant the profit margins were faked or if the supply chain was failing. Carter shook his head and delivered a truth so disgusting it made my stomach physically turn. There was no supply chain, there were no manufacturing contracts, there were no warehouses storing crystal-infused water bottles or organic vitamin supplements. The entire wellness brand was nothing but a hollow shell designed to siphon money from unsuspecting people. Chelsea and Jason were running a textbook Ponzi scheme. Carter laid out the money trail with surgical precision. For the past 2 years, Chelsea had been soliciting massive investments from local high-net-worth individuals. She promised them aggressive double-digit returns on their capital, claiming her lifestyle brand was rapidly expanding into national retail chains. But the revenue she reported on paper was entirely fabricated. She was simply taking fresh capital from new investors and using it to pay fake dividends to the older investors, creating the illusion of a highly profitable enterprise. I stared at the list of defrauded investors, and a sickening realization washed over me. I recognized almost every single name on the ledger. They were the wealthy members of my parents' exclusive country club. They were my father's former business associates. They were the affluent neighbors from Lake Forest. Richard and Linda had actively introduced their golden child to their entire social circle, proudly parading her around as a brilliant entrepreneur. My parents had effectively served as the primary recruiters for a massive financial scam, leveraging their own reputation to convince their friends to hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars to Chelsea. I asked Carter where the rest of the money went when the pyramid inevitably began to collapse. He slid a stack of high-definition photographs across the table, most of them printed directly from Chelsea's public Instagram account. He paired each photograph with a corresponding bank transaction. The $750,000 deficit was not lost in the market. It was burned on a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. Carter pointed to a picture of Chelsea and Jason posing in front of a snow-covered cabin. That was a 2-week luxury ski vacation in Aspen funded entirely by stolen investor capital. He pointed to another photo of Chelsea holding a rare designer handbag. That was a $30,000 shopping spree in Beverly Hills, charged directly to the commercial credit line, secured by my forged signature. I saw records of first-class flights to Europe, private yacht rentals, and astronomical restaurant bills. Jason had not just been carrying her shopping bags. Carter revealed that Jason was the financial architect of the cover-up. He had set up a complex web of shell companies to bounce the stolen funds around, trying to hide the money trail from the IRS. Jason was actively moving the stolen cash into their personal checking accounts, paying for their massive mortgage and their matching luxury vehicles. They were living like royalty, completely fueled by federal wire fraud and stolen identities. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. While I was managing billion-dollar portfolios for legitimate clients, waking up at 4 in the morning to analyze global markets and build a real career, my sister was playing a wealthy influencer using stolen money. She posted daily inspirational quotes about hard work and manifesting success, all while actively defrauding her own community. And when the fresh investment money dried up, when the older investors started demanding their returns, the entire house of cards began to violently collapse. That was when Chelsea and Jason realized they were facing total financial ruin and potential federal prison time. That was when my parents decided to dig into their basement, steal my social security number, and forge my signature on a massive commercial bank loan to temporarily plug the gaping hole in Chelsea's Ponzi scheme. They literally sacrificed my identity to buy their golden child a few more months of fake luxury. I sat back in my leather chair, processing the absolute depravity of my own flesh and blood. Last night at the dinner table, they had the nerve to call me jealous. They had the nerve to call me cold-blooded and isolated. They tried to guilt-trip me into wiring $750,000 of my legitimate wealth to cover their tracks. They wanted me to unknowingly wash their dirty money. If I had authorized that wire transfer, I would have been legally implicated in a massive federal financial crime. I would have become an accessory to a Ponzi scheme. My parents were perfectly willing to let me lose my licenses, my career, and my freedom just to keep Chelsea out of a federal penitentiary and maintain their pristine country club image. They viewed my hard-earned success as nothing more than a convenient insurance policy for their criminality. David looked at me, closing the binder of evidence. He asked me how I wanted to proceed, noting that we had more than enough evidence to go to the local authorities regarding the identity theft. I looked at the forged signature on the bank loan, then at the photo of Chelsea smiling smugly on a yacht paid for by stolen funds. I realized I held the ultimate power to completely decimate their entire fraudulent existence. Local authorities were not going to cut it. I was not just going to report a forged signature. I was going to let the federal government handle the destruction of my family. The immediate fallout from my visit to the bank was swift and incredibly violent. By Tuesday morning, the commercial lending department had placed a total administrative freeze on the fraudulent credit line. They had locked down every single account tied to my stolen social security number, pending a formal fraud investigation. This meant that the artificial life support keeping Chelsea and Jason afloat had been brutally disconnected overnight. They had absolutely zero access to their stolen capital. They could not pay their mortgage, they could not fund their luxury car leases, and most importantly, they could not pay the fake dividends to their angry Ponzi scheme investors. The walls were rapidly closing in on them, and panic had clearly set in. I was standing in the soaring glass-vaulted lobby of my investment firm in the heart of the Chicago financial district. It was shortly before noon. I was personally escorting two of my most lucrative clients, Mr. Harrison and Mr. Gallagher, to the ground floor after successfully closing a highly complex portfolio restructuring. The atmosphere was incredibly professional, surrounded by marble pillars, quiet classical music, and the hushed conversations of corporate executives. Just as we approached the main revolving doors, a shrill, hysterical scream shattered the refined quiet of the building. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" a voice shrieked, echoing aggressively off the marble walls. I turned around to see Chelsea completely bypassing the front reception desk. She looked absolutely manic. She was wearing a designer trench coat, but her hair was disheveled and her mascara was deliberately smeared under her eyes to create the illusion of intense suffering. She marched directly toward me, tears streaming down her face, ensuring that every single security guard, receptionist, and corporate executive in the massive lobby stopped what they were doing to watch her performance. She threw herself onto the polished floor right in front of my clients. She dropped to her knees, burying her face in her hands and letting out a loud, theatrical wail that could rival a professional soap opera actress. "You stole everything from us!" Chelsea screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. She deliberately raised her voice so the entire lobby could hear her vicious accusations. "She is a fraud. My sister is a thief. She embezzled my company savings, and now the bank is foreclosing on my home. She took my money, and now she is leaving me and my family out on the street to freeze." Mr. Harrison and Mr. Gallagher immediately took a step back, their faces registering absolute shock. In the world of private wealth management, fiduciary duty and profound trust are everything. A public accusation of embezzlement and financial theft, especially from a direct family member, is the kind of catastrophic scandal that can instantly destroy a financial manager's career. Chelsea knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that my reputation was my most valuable asset. She calculated that if she created a massive public scene and threatened to humiliate me in front of my elite clients, I would panic. She assumed I would drag her into a private office, beg her to be quiet, and immediately write her a check for $750,000 just to make the embarrassing spectacle go away. She was weaponizing my professional environment to extort me. She crawled forward and aggressively grabbed the fabric of my tailored trousers. "Please, Sydney," Chelsea wailed, staring up at me with fake desperation. "Stop hurting us. You took our parents' retirement money, and now you are stealing my livelihood. Just give us our money back. I am begging you. Do not let us become homeless just because you are greedy." I looked down at the woman gripping my leg. A younger, weaker version of me might have felt a surge of panic. I might have worried about the whispers spreading through the lobby. I might have tried to negotiate with her just to save face. But I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I did not break a sweat. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of embarrassment. I simply looked at her with the exact same expression I would use to evaluate a worthless failing stock. I smoothly detached her hands from my trousers and took a deliberate step back. I turned to my clients, maintaining perfect eye contact and an unwavering calm demeanor. "Gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this unfortunate interruption," I said, my voice projecting smooth professional authority. "My sister is currently undergoing a severe, unmedicated mental health crisis stemming from a bankrupt business venture. Please excuse her behavior. I will have building security handle this medical episode immediately." Mr. Harrison exhaled, his tense posture relaxing as my absolute calm instantly diffused the tension. "Of course, Sydney," he said, offering a sympathetic nod. "Family health issues are incredibly difficult. We will speak next week. Have a good afternoon." As my clients walked out the revolving doors, Chelsea realized her extortion tactic had completely failed. I had not panicked. I had not caved. I had effortlessly discredited her entire performance in under 10 seconds. The fake tears instantly stopped, replaced by a look of genuine, venomous hatred. She scrambled to her feet, her hands balled into tight fists. "You think you can just dismiss me?" Chelsea hissed, dropping the crying victim act completely. "You think you are so untouchable in this fancy building. I am going to call the local news. I am going to tell everyone in Chicago that you are a sociopath who destroys her own family for fun. I will ruin you." I raised my hand and signaled to the head of building security, who was already rushing across the lobby with 2 heavily built guards. They flanked Chelsea, immediately grabbing her arms to physically escort her off the private property. She struggled against the guards, her designer coat slipping off her shoulder as she continued to scream threats at me. I walked right up to her, invading her personal space, until we were inches apart. I looked directly into her panicked, furious eyes. I did not yell. I did not argue. I delivered my final verdict with the chilling precision of a judge passing a death sentence. "Enjoy your play," I whispered, my voice cutting through her hysterical screaming like a razor blade. "Because this is your last stage." I turned my back on her and walked calmly toward the private executive elevators. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, completely silencing Chelsea's frantic screams as the security guards dragged her out onto the freezing pavement. She thought she could use public shame to break my boundaries. She had absolutely no idea that while she was busy putting on a desperate theatrical performance in my lobby, my legal team was already preparing the federal documents that would lock her in a concrete cell. Sydney's heart rate was perfectly normal as she watched the heavy glass doors of the lobby close. She did not look back at Chelsea's hysterical tear-stained face, or the way her designer coat had been snagged by the security guard's grip. She simply turned and walked toward the private executive elevators. As the doors slid shut, the muted sounds of Chelsea's frantic screaming were replaced by the low hum of high-end machinery and the subtle scent of expensive wood polish. In the mirror of the elevator, Sydney looked at herself. She saw a woman who had spent a decade building a reputation that her family had tried to set on fire in a single morning. She adjusted her blazer with a sharp mechanical motion and felt the cold weight of her phone in her pocket. It was time to stop being a daughter and start being a creditor. The elevator climbed silently toward the penthouse floor. Sydney's mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the variables of the federal legal system. Her father, Richard, had deep roots in the local Chicago political scene. He played golf with the precinct captains and had donated to the mayor's re-election campaign for years. If she reported the identity theft to the local police, the report would likely sit on a desk for months. Or worse, Richard would make a single phone call and have it reviewed into oblivion. But the federal government was a different beast entirely. Federal agencies didn't care about who you played golf with in Lake Forest. They only cared about the numbers. When the doors opened, David was already waiting in her glass-walled office. He had a thick black binder on the desk and a tablet displaying a map of various bank accounts. David didn't look up when she entered. He was too focused on the data provided by Carter, the forensic accountant. "The situation is deeper than we thought," David said, his voice as sharp as his tailored suit. "Chelsea is not just running a Ponzi scheme for local investors. She has been using your credit line to launder the initial dividends to keep the older investors quiet. By using your social security number to back the commercial loan, she managed to create a paper trail that looks like legitimate business revenue on the surface. But when you follow the wire transfers, it is all circular." Sydney sat down behind her desk, the leather chair creaking softly. "What is the timeline?" "She has a founders' gala scheduled for Wednesday evening," David replied, tapping the screen. "It is a recruitment event at a high-end hotel downtown. She is targeting the retirement funds of your parents' friends from the country club. She is looking for another $500,000 to keep the pyramid from collapsing for another quarter. She needs that money in the next 48 hours, Sydney." Sydney looked out the window at the Chicago skyline, the gray clouds hanging heavy over the lake. 48 hours, the exact amount of time it would take for a federal administrative freeze to ripple through the banking system. "We are not going to the local police," Sydney said, her voice dripping with clinical detachment. "If we go local, my father will try to bury it. We are going federal." "David, I want you to open the portals for the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We are not just reporting identity theft. We are reporting bank fraud, wire fraud, and a massive tax evasion scheme." David nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "The IRS whistleblower portal is the most effective. If we file a Form 211 with the evidence Carter found, they will have her accounts flagged by tomorrow morning. And the FBI's IC3 division handles the interstate wire fraud. Since she moved money between Illinois and her shell companies in Delaware, it is their jurisdiction." Sydney leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen as the digital forms began to appear. She was not just filing a report. She was launching an execution. She watched as David uploaded the forensic binders, the images of the forged signatures and the logs of the circular wire transfers. Every click of the mouse felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of her former life. "What about your parents?" David asked, pausing before hitting the submit button on the identity theft affidavit. "This report explicitly names Richard and Linda as the primary witnesses who validated the forged documents. They will be charged as accessories to bank fraud." Sydney did not hesitate. She remembered the dinner table 2 nights ago. She remembered her father telling her she was dead to him if she did not pay for Chelsea's crimes. She remembered her mother calling her a cold, calculating machine because she did not have a husband or children to soften her heart. They chose their side, Sydney stated coldly. They used my life as an insurance policy for a criminal. They did not care about my career, my licenses, or my freedom. Why should I care about their retirement? Submit the documents, David. The final click echoed in the quiet office. A notification appeared on the screen. Report successfully submitted. Reference numbers generated. The clock had officially started. In 48 hours, Chelsea would be standing on a stage at her gala trying to solicit money from unsuspecting retirees. And that was exactly when the federal freeze would hit. Just then, Sydney's phone vibrated on the desk. A text message from her mother flashed on the screen. "You are a monster, Sydney. I just spoke to Chelsea. She is in tears because of what you did to her today. I am meeting with our lawyer tonight to have you permanently removed from the family trust. I hope your money keeps you warm at night because you have no one else." Sydney stared at the text. A year ago, these words would have felt like a knife in her gut. Now they were just data points. She did not reply. She did not even feel the urge to defend herself. "You cannot disinherit a stranger," Sydney whispered to the empty office. She turned her phone face down and looked at the clock. The countdown was at 47 hours and 59 minutes. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and told David to keep his phone on. She was going to spend the next 2 days ensuring that by the time the FBI knocked on her parents' door, there would not be a single piece of her left for them to burn. She walked out of the building and into the cold Chicago night, the wind no longer feeling like a threat, but like a clean slate. Tuesday morning brought a new level of psychological warfare. I was sitting at my mahogany desk reviewing a quarterly earnings report for a high-net-worth client when my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood. It was not a single call. It was a relentless, synchronized avalanche of notifications. The screen lit up with names I had not seen in years. Aunts, uncles, second cousins, and distant family friends were suddenly flooding my inbox with an unprecedented level of hostility. I unlocked the screen and opened my social media applications. There, sitting at the absolute top of my feed with hundreds of reactions and dozens of shares, was a massive public manifesto written by my mother. Linda had orchestrated a digital crucifixion, and she had executed it with the precision of a seasoned manipulator. The post featured a heavily edited black-and-white photograph of Chelsea holding her 4-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a perfectly healthy child who occasionally suffered from mild seasonal allergies. But in Linda's fabricated narrative, he was fighting for his life. The text of the post was a masterclass in weaponized guilt. Linda wrote that the family was facing an unimaginable tragedy. She claimed little Leo had been diagnosed with a rare aggressive respiratory condition, and that his experimental medical treatments had drained Chelsea and Jason of their life savings. She explicitly stated that the $750,000 debt was entirely medical debt accumulated to keep my nephew breathing. Then came the character assassination. Linda wrote that they had swallowed their pride and gone to their highly successful wealthy daughter in Chicago to beg for a temporary loan to save the child's life. She told her entire social network that I had looked at my dying nephew, laughed in my sister's face, and coldly stated that my investment portfolios were more important than a child's heartbeat. She ended the post by declaring that I was a soulless corporate machine dead to the family and warning all her friends to pray for my empty, miserable life. It was a complete and utter fabrication, a lie so bold and legally dangerous that it took my breath away for a fraction of a second. Chelsea did not have medical debt. She had credit card debt from buying designer handbags and flying first class to luxury resorts. But the extended family did not know that. They only saw a grieving grandmother pleading for a sick child, and they instantly turned into a pack of rabid wolves. The messages in my inbox were vicious. My Aunt Patricia sent a long, rambling text calling me a sociopathic monster who deserved to die alone. My Uncle Greg left a scathing voicemail stating he was thoroughly ashamed to share my last name and hoping my wealth would rot in my hands. Cousins I had not spoken to since high school were actively tagging my corporate employer in the comment section, demanding that I be fired for moral bankruptcy. They were acting as Linda's personal army, blindly attacking the designated target, without a single shred of actual evidence. A younger, weaker version of myself would have panicked. I would have drafted a frantic public response, desperately trying to defend my character and explain the truth about the Ponzi scheme. I would have cried in my office, terrified of being ostracized by the entire extended family tree. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. Linda had just handed me the final fatal nail for her own coffin. I did not reply to a single message. I did not block anyone. I did not turn off my notifications or make my profile private. I opened a secure encrypted folder on my dual monitor setup and named it Defamation Evidence. I systematically opened every single hateful text message, every aggressive voicemail, and every single comment under Linda's post. I took high-resolution screenshots of everything. I meticulously documented the timestamps, the names of the senders, and the specific violent language they used. In the financial sector, reputation is a tangible asset. If a private wealth manager is publicly accused of heinous, immoral acts, it can trigger catastrophic professional damages. Clients can pull their funds. Regulatory boards can initiate conduct reviews. My mother was not just venting her frustration, she was actively committing defamation per se, publishing malicious lies that directly threatened my livelihood and my corporate standing. I picked up my phone and dialed David. He answered on the first ring. I instructed him to immediately open my social media pages and read the post my mother had just published. I listened to the sound of his keyboard clicking through the receiver. "This is actionable," David stated, his tone shifting into predatory lawyer mode. "This goes way beyond family drama, Sydney. She is directly accusing you of moral turpitude and inciting public harassment against your professional profile. We can attach a massive civil defamation suit to the ongoing federal fraud case. She is handing us the exact leverage we need to strip them of whatever remaining assets the federal government does not seize." I told David to draft the preservation of evidence letters and prepare the cease and desist orders, but to hold them. I did not want to interrupt my mother's victory lap. I wanted her to feel powerful. I wanted her to sit in her suburban house, watching the likes and sympathetic comments roll in, genuinely believing she had successfully destroyed my reputation. I organized the final screenshot, dragged it into the encrypted folder, and securely locked the drive. I looked out the window of my corner office. My family was spending their Tuesday morning launching a digital witch hunt, entirely fueled by lies and desperate ego. They were so focused on winning the public relations battle on social media that they were completely blind to the federal executioner walking right up to their front door. The countdown clock in my head continued to tick. 36 hours remained until the federal administrative freeze would lock their bank accounts. Let them type. Let them post. Let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly could. I was going to bury them in it. Tuesday afternoon continued its relentless march forward. I was deep into a complex risk assessment model for a new tech acquisition when my secure office line chimed. It was the direct extension for Jonathan Caldwell, the senior managing partner and founder of our investment fund. A sudden summons to the top floor usually meant one of two things in the high-stakes world of private wealth management. You were either getting a massive promotion, or security was about to hand you a cardboard box and watch you clear out your desk. Given the digital circus my mother had just unleashed on social media, I naturally assumed the latter. I locked my workstation, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, and took the private elevator up to the executive suite. I was fully prepared to defend my career. When I walked through the double-glass doors of Jonathan Caldwell's expansive corner office, I braced myself for the absolute worst. I expected to see the human resources director sitting there with a termination packet ready to sever ties to protect the pristine reputation of the firm. Instead, Jonathan was sitting entirely alone behind his massive oak desk. He was holding a silver pen, spinning it casually between his fingers and looking entirely too amused. He gestured for me to sit down in the leather chair opposite him. He did not look angry or concerned. He looked like a man who had just heard a particularly entertaining joke and was waiting for the punchline to land. "Sydney," Jonathan began, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. I just received a highly disturbing phone call on my private executive line. It seems a man claiming to be your father, Richard, managed to bypass my gatekeepers by stating he had a severe corporate emergency involving one of my directors. He spoke to me for 20 straight minutes. I kept my face perfectly still, betraying absolutely no emotion, though my heart beat a fraction faster. I asked Jonathan what exactly my father had told him. Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He told me that you are currently the primary target of a massive federal financial fraud investigation. He claimed you have been embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from your sister's wellness business, and that the federal authorities are actively preparing to indict you. He strongly advised me, as a concerned father and a pillar of the Chicago business community, to terminate your employment immediately before the media catches wind of the scandal. He painted you as a toxic, unstable liability who was about to drag this entire investment fund into a catastrophic public relations nightmare. The sheer, unadulterated venom of my father's strategy hit me like a physical blow. Richard knew exactly how conservative the private wealth sector was. He knew that the mere whisper of federal fraud could trigger an automatic suspension pending a rigorous internal compliance review. My father was no longer just trying to force me to pay Chelsea's debt. He was actively attempting to execute my career. He wanted to strip away my financial independence, destroy my income stream, and force me to crawl back to the family begging for mercy and a roof over my head. It was the ultimate scorched earth tactic designed to completely neutralize my power. I looked Jonathan dead in the eye and opened my mouth, fully prepared to explain the reality of the forged commercial loan and the identity theft. But before I could utter a single syllable of defense, Jonathan burst into genuine booming laughter. He reached across his desk and slid a heavy leather-bound folder directly in front of me. I opened it. It was the finalized, fully executed contract for the $50 million portfolio restructuring I had just closed yesterday afternoon with my top-tier clients. Your father clearly has absolutely no idea who he is dealing with, Jonathan said, his amusement shifting into a predatory shark-like grin. He actually thinks I am going to fire my top-performing wealth manager, a woman who just secured a $50 million capital injection for this fund because of some pathetic suburban family gossip. He genuinely thought he could call my private line and manipulate my executive roster. Jonathan stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the bustling financial district below. In our business, Sydney, we do not operate on emotional manipulation. We operate on numbers. You brought in $50 million of clean, verified, high-yield capital yesterday. Your father brings nothing but cheap threats and transparent lies. You are a cornerstone of this firm, and nobody threatens my people. I closed the leather folder, a massive surge of adrenaline replacing the ice in my veins. I thanked him for his unwavering trust and briefly outlined the actual truth. I explained that my parents had committed identity theft to cover a Ponzi scheme and that I had already filed federal reports with the authorities. I told him my father's phone call was a desperate attempt at corporate sabotage to punish me for freezing their stolen funds. Jonathan's smile vanished, entirely replaced by the ruthless corporate instincts that had built his billion-dollar empire. He walked back to his desk and pressed the intercom button. He requested the head of our corporate legal division to come to his office immediately. He looked at me with absolute authority. We protect our own Sydney. I am authorizing our corporate legal team to fully support your personal lawyer. We are going to hit your father with a corporate tortious interference lawsuit that will make his head spin. He attempted to actively sabotage the employment contract of a senior executive at this fund. We will bury him in civil litigation so deep he will never see daylight again. Use our resources. Crush him. I walked out of Jonathan Caldwell's office feeling like I was wearing a suit of armor forged from solid titanium. Richard thought he could isolate me. He thought calling my boss would sever my lifeline and leave me drowning. He had absolutely no idea that he had just kicked a hornet's nest of ruthless corporate lawyers. The 48-hour countdown was ticking closer to zero, and now I had the entire weight of a Wall Street-level investment fund backing my play. The adrenaline from my meeting with the senior managing partner was still buzzing intensely through my system as I took the private executive elevator down to the subterranean parking garage. The underground facility beneath our financial district headquarters was an absolute fortress. It was brightly lit with harsh fluorescent bulbs, heavily climate-controlled and restricted exclusively to top-tier management personnel. I walked toward my reserved parking spot, the sharp click of my heels echoing rhythmically off the thick concrete pillars. My mind was already mapping out the precise legal strategy my corporate attorneys were drafting to annihilate my father. I reached into my designer handbag to retrieve my car keys, completely focused on the road ahead and the impending destruction of my toxic relatives. I did not even have the chance to unlock my vehicle before a dark shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar right next to my luxury sedan. Jason stepped directly into my path, completely blocking the driver's side door. The sight of my brother-in-law standing in my highly secured corporate parking garage was intensely jarring. The arrogant wine-sipping parasite from Friday night was completely gone. In his place stood a desperate, frantic man, whose artificial reality was rapidly and violently collapsing. His expensive tailored coat was wrinkled. His posture was erratic, and his eyes darted around the concrete structure with the paranoid, unpredictable energy of a cornered animal. He had somehow tailgated another executive vehicle to bypass the heavy security gates. It was a pathetic, reckless move that perfectly highlighted his sheer desperation and total lack of foresight. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Sydney?" Jason sneered, stepping aggressively closer to my personal space. "You think freezing that bank account was going to stop us from getting what we need? You think you can just cut off our cash flow, walk away from your own flesh and blood, and survive without any consequences?" I stood perfectly still, my expression utterly bored and completely devoid of fear. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not take a single step back. "How exactly did you manage to sneak into a restricted corporate facility, Jason?" I asked, my voice echoing with icy, calculated detachment. "Because trespassing on private commercial property is an excellent way to end your Tuesday afternoon in the back of a police cruiser." Jason ignored my question entirely, his face twisting into a malicious, desperate grin. He reached frantically into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He shoved it roughly toward my chest, practically demanding that I take it. "Since you decided to play hardball with the first credit line, we are taking a completely different route," he demanded, his voice shaking with forced bravado and suppressed panic. "Chelsea needs a massive bridge loan to keep the business afloat until the end of the fiscal quarter. This is a new guarantor application for a high-yield private lender. You are going to sign it right now. You are going to put your precious, pristine name on this dotted line, and we are going to walk away with the cash we need to fix this entire mess." I looked at the crumpled paper in his trembling hand, then back up at his flushed face. The sheer, blinding stupidity of his demand was almost difficult to comprehend. He was actively drowning in a federal fraud investigation, and his brilliant survival strategy was to demand another fraudulent loan from the very person who reported him. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed through the empty garage. "You are absolutely out of your mind if you think I am signing a single piece of paper for you or my sister." Jason took another step forward, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "You are going to sign it, Sydney, or I am going to destroy your pristine corporate reputation by tomorrow morning," he threatened, spitting the words with absolute venom. "Richard told us your boss did not fire you today. Fine. But let us see how your elite firm reacts when the local Chicago news stations run a prime-time investigative story on your total lack of morality. I have already drafted the press release. I will tell the media exactly how a millionaire private wealth manager maliciously forced her own sister into bankruptcy. I will paint you as a ruthless corporate monster who abandoned her struggling family for profit. The media absolutely loves a story about a greedy Wall Street type stepping on the little guy. Your high net worth clients will drop you the second your name is dragged through the mud on public television. Sign the paper, Sydney. Buy my silence right now, or I'm going straight to the press." He stood there, panting slightly, thoroughly convinced he had just delivered a fatal checkmate. He genuinely believed that the threat of local media exposure would terrify a woman who handled $50 million transactions before lunch. He thought his amateur blackmail attempt was a masterstroke of leverage that would instantly break my boundaries. I did not yell. I did not argue with his ridiculous fabricated narrative. I simply raised my left wrist, bringing my Apple Watch directly up to my mouth. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I tapped the digital screen and illuminated the bright red recording icon. The digital timer began ticking upward in stark glowing numbers, capturing every single sound in the concrete garage. I looked Jason dead in the eye, dropping the temperature of my voice to absolute zero. "Jason," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal legal precision. "Let me ensure I have this entirely accurately documented for the federal authorities. You bypassed restricted corporate security to corner a senior financial executive in a private facility. You are currently demanding that I sign a financial guarantee for a commercial loan under the explicit threat of launching a malicious defamatory media campaign to damage my professional livelihood." Jason stared at my wrist, his arrogant smirk instantly evaporating into thin air. The color drained entirely out of his face as the sheer reality of my words hit his brain. I took a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to instinctively stumble back. "Are you actually stupid enough to attempt felony extortion against a highly licensed financial professional in a private executive garage that is actively monitored by 24/7 high-definition security cameras?" I asked, gesturing gracefully toward the sleek black camera dome mounted directly above his head. "You just committed a textbook felony on tape. You just handed me recorded evidence of blackmail to add directly to the massive federal wire fraud investigation your wife is currently facing." The total absolute panic that washed over Jason's face was nothing short of glorious. The realization that he had just incriminated himself beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt hit him like a freight train. He looked up at the security camera, then down at the recording timer on my watch, his chest heaving with sudden, unadulterated terror. He had walked in expecting to extort a frightened, guilty daughter. He had just handed a loaded gun to a corporate predator. "You are a psycho?" Jason stammered, his voice cracking violently as he stumbled backward away from my car. "You are completely insane." He did not wait for my response. He turned around and practically sprinted across the concrete floor, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically as he fled toward the exit stairwell. He dropped the crumpled bridge loan application on the ground in his desperate haste to escape my presence. I watched his pathetic retreat until the heavy metal fire door slammed shut behind him, echoing loudly through the empty parking garage. I tapped my watch, ending the recording, and immediately saving the high-quality audio file to my secure encrypted cloud drive. I bent down, picked up the abandoned loan document, and tossed it casually onto the passenger seat of my car. It was just another piece of physical evidence to hand directly to the federal agents. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the powerful hum of the motor matching the steady, victorious rhythm of my heart. The third wave of their attack had failed spectacularly. The 48-hour clock was ticking down to its final hours, and my parasitic family was completely out of ammunition. I drove out of the underground garage and merged onto the bustling Chicago streets. The encounter with my brother-in-law had not shaken me in the slightest. Instead, it had illuminated a massive, gaping vulnerability in their overall strategy. Jason and Chelsea were undeniably desperate, cornered by their own financial incompetence and terrified of the impending collapse. But my parents, Richard and Linda, still believed they held a protective shield. They still believed that their pristine suburban estate in Lake Forest insulated them from the actual consequences of the fraud they had enabled. They genuinely thought that worst-case scenario, they could just sell their assets, hire an expensive defense attorney, and insulate their golden child from federal prison. I realized right then that simply reporting the identity theft to the authorities was not going to be entirely sufficient. I did not just want to see my sister indicted. I wanted absolute, undeniable leverage over every single asset my parents possessed. I wanted to legally own the very roof over their heads. I bypassed my condominium entirely and drove straight back to the law firm. It was approaching 7 in the evening on Tuesday, but I knew David would still be at his desk, reviewing the forensic accounting files. I walked into his office and instructed him to pull up the secondary lien documents attached to Chelsea's business. "Carter, our investigator had already established that the total default was $750,000. $250,000 of that was the commercial loan tied to my stolen Social Security number. But I needed to know exactly who owned the remaining $500,000 of toxic debt. David pulled up the corporate filings on his large monitor. He explained that Jason had secured the remaining $500,000 through a syndicate of highly aggressive private mezzanine lenders. These were not traditional banks. They were ruthless private equity groups that charged astronomical interest rates to fund high-risk ventures. And more importantly, David revealed the exact collateral Jason had used to secure that massive private loan. He had not used the wellness company inventory because there was none. Jason had convinced Richard and Linda to secretly pledge their sprawling Lake Forest estate as the primary collateral for the mezzanine debt. My parents had quite literally bet their entire retirement and their multi-million-dollar home on Chelsea's fraudulent Ponzi scheme. I looked at the screen, a cold, calculating smile forming on my face. I asked David what would happen if those private lenders suddenly discovered that the wellness brand was a complete phantom and that the federal government was 48 hours away from freezing every connected asset. David smirked, adjusting his glasses. He stated that those private equity groups would instantly panic. Distressed asset lenders hate federal investigations because government seizures usually wipe out secondary creditors. If they knew an indictment was imminent, they would be utterly desperate to offload that toxic debt to anyone willing to buy it just to recoup a fraction of their initial investment. That was the exact moment I launched my final fatal strike. I did not just want to be a victim of identity theft. I wanted to become the apex predator in their financial ecosystem. I instructed David to contact the managing partners of those private lending groups immediately. I told him to leverage his corporate reputation and arrange a highly confidential emergency acquisition meeting for Wednesday morning. I was going to use my own personal capital, the wealth I had built through years of relentless discipline, to buy my family's entire debt portfolio. Wednesday morning arrived with a heavy, overcast sky. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom at a private wealth advisory firm downtown, directly across from three incredibly nervous private equity managers. David had strategically leaked just enough information to terrify them. He had hinted that Chelsea's company was facing catastrophic regulatory hurdles and that the underlying collateral might soon be tied up in years of federal litigation. The lenders were sweating. They had $500,000 sinking in a toxic asset, and they wanted out before the ship completely submerged. I did not waste time with negotiations. I slid a single legally binding term sheet across the table. I offered to purchase the entire $500,000 promissory note, including all attached collateral rights, for exactly 40 cents on the dollar. I was offering them $200,000 in immediate verified cash to walk away from the impending disaster. The lead manager tried to bluster, claiming the Lake Forest estate was worth far more than the loan value. I cut him off instantly. I reminded him that foreclosing on a property during an active federal fraud investigation would take his legal team 5 years and cost him hundreds of thousands in attorney fees. I pushed a certified cashier's check onto the table. I told them they could take the guaranteed cash right now and walk away clean, or they could fight the federal government for scraps next year. They took the cash. Within 45 minutes, the transfer agreements were fully executed. I signed my name to the Uniform Commercial Code financing statements and the official assignment of debt contracts. I watched the private lenders hurriedly pack their briefcases and exit the boardroom, visibly relieved to have dumped the toxic liability. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the remote control to a financial nuclear bomb. David collected the signed contracts and placed them into a secure leather binder. He looked at me with a mixture of profound professional respect and sheer awe. He laid out the new legal reality with absolute precision. By purchasing those promissory notes, I had legally stepped into the shoes of the primary creditor. I was no longer just a sister or a daughter. I was the sole legal owner of their massive defaulted debt, because the loan was already severely delinquent. David explained, I possessed the unilateral immediate right to execute a demand for full repayment. And when Richard and Linda inevitably failed to produce $500,000 in cash, I held the absolute legal authority to initiate an immediate hostile foreclosure on their Lake Forest estate. I literally held the deed to the house where they had mocked my career and plotted to steal my identity. I stood up from the boardroom table, smoothing my tailored suit. I had completely neutralized their only remaining shelter. They thought they could use my name to fund their fake empire. Instead, I had used my actual wealth to buy the ground right out from under their feet. The trap was now perfectly and flawlessly set. It was Wednesday afternoon. Chelsea was currently setting up the catering for her fraudulent investor gala, and my parents were likely getting dressed in their finest country club attire, completely oblivious to the fact that I now legally owned their entire existence. I told David to prepare the foreclosure notices and have the process servers ready to deploy. The 48-hour clock was hitting zero, and it was time to let the federal agents crash the party. Wednesday evening descended upon the Lake Forest estate with a biting chill, but inside the sprawling suburban mansion, the atmosphere was practically radiant. A roaring fire crackled in the massive stone hearth of the formal living room, casting a warm golden glow across the expensive leather furniture and curated art pieces. Richard stood by the custom mahogany wet bar, uncorking a bottle of vintage French champagne that easily cost more than a standard mortgage payment. He poured the sparkling liquid into 4 crystal flutes, his chest puffed out with the arrogant pride of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. Linda sat on the pristine white sofa, her phone in one hand, and a self-satisfied smirk permanently etched onto her face. Chelsea and Jason lounged in the matching armchairs across from her, completely relaxed and buzzing with adrenaline. They were entirely dressed up for Chelsea's upcoming investor gala, wearing thousands of dollars worth of designer clothing paid for entirely by stolen funds. The air in the room was thick with unearned victory. "I told you she would crack," Richard announced, passing the crystal flutes around the room. He took a generous sip of his champagne and let out a booming, triumphant laugh that filled the high ceilings of the estate. Richard pulled his phone from his tailored slacks and tapped the screen, holding it up for the entire room to see. At exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon, I received a notification from the primary commercial lender. The status on the $250,000 credit line officially changed from severe default to account transferred and settled. The secondary private equity loans also reflect a zero balance on our end. The debt has been completely wiped off our immediate ledger. Chelsea squealed with delight, clapping her hands together like a spoiled child receiving a new toy. "I knew it," she cheered, leaning over to kiss Jason on the cheek. "I knew Sydney would not actually let us go down. She acts so tough with her corporate suits and her downtown penthouse, but at the end of the day, she is terrified of being the family outcast. She probably saw Mom's post on social media and completely panicked." Linda took a delicate sip from her flute, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. It was the public pressure, Linda stated confidently, taking full credit for the supposed victory. "I had aunts, uncles, and cousins from 3 different states messaging her all day yesterday. I made sure everyone in our social circle knew exactly what a cold and heartless woman she was being. A private wealth manager simply cannot afford that kind of catastrophic public relations nightmare. Her firm deals with high net worth clients who value family optics and philanthropic dedication. She realized that if she did not open her checkbook and fix this mess quietly, her entire professional reputation would be dragged through the mud. We gave her no other choice but to surrender unconditionally. She wrote the check because she knows her place in this hierarchy." Jason leaned back in his chair, swirling his champagne with a smug, highly punchable grin. "I have to admit I was slightly worried when she started recording me in the parking garage yesterday," Jason said, completely misreading his own narrow escape from an extortion charge. "But it was clearly just a pathetic bluff. She was trying to scare us because she knew she had already lost the upper hand. The second she realized we were actually willing to go to the local press and ruin her pristine image, she folded like a cheap suit. She paid off the bank, bought out the private equity guys, and cleaned up the entire financial mess just to save her own skin. We played her perfectly." Richard nodded in absolute agreement, raising his glass higher into the air. To family loyalty, Richard proposed, his voice dripping with profound irony and unearned superiority. And to knowing exactly how to handle a stubborn, ungrateful daughter who needed to be reminded of her obligations. They all clapped their glasses together, the sharp chime of crystal ringing clearly through the living room. They were throwing a massive celebration, entirely convinced that they had successfully extorted me out of $750,000. They genuinely believed that my silence over the past 48 hours was the silence of total submission and defeat. They thought my refusal to answer their frantic calls or respond to the aggressive social media attacks meant I was sitting in my office utterly broken and writing massive checks to save their fraudulent empire. Chelsea immediately shifted the conversation to her upcoming gala, completely detached from the reality of her collapsing Ponzi scheme. Now that the bank is off our backs, we can focus entirely on tonight's recruitment event, Chelsea gushed, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace. The wealthy country club crowd is going to be there. I have pitches prepared for at least 6 new major investors. If we can secure another $500,000 tonight, we can expand the brand, redecorate the Aspen rental property, and finally upgrade Jason's luxury SUV. This is just the beginning for us. Linda smiled warmly at her golden child, completely validating the sheer delusion. You are going to be brilliant tonight, sweetheart, Linda praised, reaching over to pat Chelsea's knee. You have worked so hard for this lifestyle brand. You deserve every single ounce of success coming your way. Sydney's little financial contribution is just a minor bump in the road, a small tax she owes for being so difficult. She should be honored to invest in her sister's brilliant future. They continued to drink, laugh, and plan their extravagant criminal future. They were sitting comfortably in a multi-million-dollar estate that they no longer legally owned. They were celebrating the erasure of a debt that had not actually vanished, but had simply been weaponized against them by the very person they thought they had brutally defeated. They felt incredibly powerful, financially secure, and entirely untouchable. They had absolutely no idea that their cheerful champagne toast was essentially a farewell party to their freedom. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the federal deadline had officially expired, and the absolute full weight of the United States government was currently speeding down their quiet suburban street in a fleet of black tactical vehicles. The sharp crystal chime of their celebrating glasses had barely faded into the warm air of the living room when a sudden violent pounding shattered the quiet suburban evening. It was not a polite neighborly knock. It was a heavy, authoritative hammering against the thick oak wood of the front door, the kind of aggressive thud that physically shook the doorframe and echoed through the grand hallway. The heavy blows came in a rapid, relentless succession. Richard lowered his champagne flute, his face instantly flushing with deep irritation. He let out a loud scoff, clearly annoyed that his victory lap was being interrupted. He muttered something under his breath about incompetent delivery drivers not knowing how to use a standard doorbell. He straightened his expensive tailored blazer, set his drink down on the pristine coffee table, and marched out of the living room with the arrogant stride of a man who believed he owned the entire neighborhood. Linda, Chelsea, and Jason remained in their comfortable leather seats, utterly unbothered, completely expecting Richard to yell at a teenager holding a pizza box. Instead, the moment Richard unlocked and yanked the heavy front door open, the illusion of their untouchable suburban fortress instantly evaporated. There was no delivery driver standing on the porch. The sweeping stone driveway was illuminated by the harsh, strobing glare of red and blue emergency lights. Half a dozen black, unmarked tactical vehicles were parked erratically across the manicured lawn, blocking any possible exit. Standing shoulder to shoulder on the front welcome mat were men and women wearing dark, heavy windbreakers. The bold, bright yellow letters printed across their chests read FBI and IRS. Before Richard could even open his mouth to demand an explanation, a tall, broad-shouldered federal agent stepped directly across the threshold, forcing my father to instinctively stumble backward onto his imported marble floor. The agent did not ask for permission to enter. He held up a thick stack of legal documents sealed with the official stamp of a federal judge. "Richard, you are hereby ordered to step away from the door," the lead agent commanded, his voice projecting absolute, uncompromising authority. We are executing a federal search warrant authorized by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. Remain entirely visible and keep your hands completely empty. My father's arrogant posture collapsed in a fraction of a second. His jaw dropped open and the deep flush color completely drained from his face. He tried to stammer out a protest, attempting to use his country club bravado to intimidate the armed federal agent standing in his foyer. He demanded to call his personal lawyer. He yelled that he knew the mayor of Chicago. The agents completely ignored his pathetic attempts at establishing dominance. They did not care about his golf buddies or his campaign donations. They only cared about the warrant. Within 10 seconds, the front entrance was completely overrun. A dozen agents swarmed into the grand hallway, their heavy tactical boots thundering against the polished stone. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, immediately spreading out to secure every single room on the ground floor. Linda, hearing the commotion, rushed out of the living room with her champagne glass still gripped tightly in her hand. When she saw the federal windbreakers filling her pristine hallway, she let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. The glass slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered violently against the marble floor, sending expensive champagne pooling around her designer shoes. She frantically grabbed her husband's arm, hyperventilating as armed personnel marched right past her and began securing the perimeters. Jason and Chelsea sprinted out of the living room right behind her, completely frozen by the terrifying spectacle unfolding in their sanctuary. Chelsea, the lead agent, stated, locking his eyes directly onto my sister. You are officially the subject of an ongoing federal criminal investigation regarding interstate wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and the operation of an illegal financial Ponzi scheme. We are seizing all electronic devices, physical financial records, and business documentation located on this property. Chelsea's knees practically gave out. She let out a guttural, panicked wail, completely abandoning her polished influencer persona. She instinctively clutched her expensive smartphone to her chest, the very device she used to run her fraudulent empire and post her fake luxury lifestyle. A female agent immediately stepped forward, firmly gripping Chelsea's wrist and physically prying the locked cell phone straight out of her desperate grip. Chelsea screamed that they had no right to take her property, sobbing hysterically as the agent calmly placed the device into a static-proof evidence bag. Jason, realizing the sheer magnitude of the raid, made a sudden, incredibly foolish dart toward the back study. That room served as his makeshift financial office, where he kept the primary laptop used to shuffle the stolen investor funds through his network of fraudulent shell companies. He did not even make it 5 steps down the corridor before 2 massive FBI agents intercepted him, shoving him roughly back against the drywall and instructing him to remain entirely stationary. Do not move another inch, one of the agents warned, pointing a rigid finger at Jason's chest. If you attempt to destroy, alter, or conceal any digital evidence, you will be placed in handcuffs and immediately charged with obstruction of justice. Jason pressed his back against the wall, his chest heaving with unadulterated terror. He watched helplessly as an IRS forensic technician casually walked into his study, opened his expensive leather briefcase, and pulled out his primary laptop. The technician began bagging his external hard drives, his printed bank ledgers, and his encrypted storage devices. The entire financial architecture of their criminal enterprise was being systematically dismantled and bagged for evidence right in front of their eyes. Linda was practically weeping onto Richard's shoulder, begging the agents to stop ruining her beautiful house. She screamed that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, claiming that they were a respectable, wealthy family who had just cleared all of their debts with the bank. She frantically yelled that her oldest daughter was a highly successful private wealth manager who had already taken care of the financial issues. The lead IRS agent paused while tagging a stack of fraudulent tax returns. He looked at Linda with a cold, almost pitying expression. Your bank debts are not our concern, he stated flatly. The federal government does not care about your commercial credit line. We care about the $500,000 your daughter stole from local retirees, and we care about the fraudulent tax documents you signed to hide that money. Nobody cleared anything. Your accounts were flagged for suspicious activity 2 days ago by an external whistleblower. The word whistleblower hung in the air like a physical executioner's blade. The realization hit the four of them with the catastrophic force of an earthquake. The warm, triumphant champagne buzzing in their blood instantly turned to pure ice. Sydney had not paid the bank. Sydney had not surrendered to their social media blackmail. Sydney had not been sitting in her penthouse crying over their threats. Sydney had spent the last 48 hours handing their entire criminal operation directly to the federal government. She had been the one to lock the doors, pull the alarms, and burn their fraudulent empire straight to the ground. The fake tears, the extortion attempts, and the vicious public defamation had achieved absolutely nothing but accelerating their own demise. They stood helplessly in the center of their grand foyer, completely surrounded by federal agents packing their luxurious, stolen lifestyle into brown cardboard evidence boxes. The roaring fire in the living room continued to crackle warmly, casting long dancing shadows over the four half-empty crystal champagne flutes sitting abandoned on the coffee table. Their celebration of my supposed defeat had perfectly morphed into the grand opening of their worst nightmare. And the federal raid was only the beginning of the horrors I had arranged for them tonight. The federal agents were no longer merely tagging electronics and bagging financial documents. The atmosphere in the grand foyer shifted violently as a stern female agent stepped directly in front of Chelsea. She grabbed my sister by the arm with practiced, uncompromising force. Chelsea thrashed wildly, her expensive designer heels slipping uncontrollably on the polished marble floor. "You cannot do this to me," Chelsea shrieked, her voice cracking into a primal, terrified wail that echoed off the high ceilings. "I have a son. I am a respectable business owner. You are making a massive mistake." The agent ignored her, completely twisting Chelsea's arms firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut pierced the air. It was a sound that completely shattered the illusion of their wealthy, untouchable suburban utopia. Jason, witnessing his wife being physically shackled, made a sudden, incredibly foolish decision. He tried to lunge forward to intervene, yelling at the federal officers to let her go. He was instantly tackled by two massive agents who slammed him face first against the custom mahogany wet bar. The crystal champagne flutes they had been drinking from just 20 minutes ago crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 tiny pieces. An agent firmly pressed his knee into Jason's spine and began loudly reciting his Miranda rights, informing him that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit interstate wire fraud and federal tax evasion. Linda was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching Richard's arm, as if he could somehow magically fix this catastrophic reality with his country club connections. Richard was completely paralyzed. He stood frozen by the shattered glass, staring at his handcuffed daughter and son-in-law with wide, uncomprehending eyes. He was watching his entire legacy burn to the ground in real time. But the absolute nightmare was far from over. Through the open front door, past the flashing red and blue emergency lights of the federal vehicles, a quiet, unassuming man in a plain gray suit walked into the house. He was not wearing an FBI windbreaker. He did not carry a weapon or a badge. He held a thick, heavy stack of legal documents clamped tightly onto a sturdy wooden clipboard. He calmly navigated around the federal agents bagging evidence and walked directly up to my parents, completely unfazed by the criminal chaos surrounding them. "Richard and Linda." The man stated, his voice carrying the bored mechanical tone of someone executing a routine administrative task. "I am a legally appointed process server for the state of Illinois. I have been instructed by the court to serve you both directly." He thrust the heavy stack of legal documents into Richard's trembling hands. Richard stared blindly at the front page, his brain seemingly unable to process any more devastating information. Linda peered over his shoulder, her tear-stained eyes widening in absolute horror as she read the bold, capitalized heading printed across the very top of the document. "Notice of default and intent to foreclose." "There must be a mistake," Richard stammered, his voice weak and completely stripped of its usual arrogance. He shook his head frantically. "We just received official confirmation from our bank this afternoon. The secondary loans on this property were completely cleared. The debt was settled. You have the wrong house." The process server offered a thin, pitying smile. "The debt was not settled, sir," he corrected, pulling a pen from his pocket. The debt was acquired. Your $500,000 promissory note, along with the primary deed to this estate used as collateral, was purchased in its entirety early Wednesday morning by a new private entity. Because your loan was already in a severe default status, the new creditor has executed an immediate demand for full repayment. The man tapped the clipboard, highlighting a specific legal clause. Since you cannot produce $500,000 in cash, right now the creditor has legally initiated a hostile foreclosure. This property is officially frozen. You are strictly prohibited from selling, modifying, or removing any fixed assets from this estate. You have 30 days to vacate the premises before the local sheriff arrives to change the locks. You are officially losing this house. Linda let out a strangled, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She grabbed the foreclosure documents from Richard and frantically flipped to the second page, scanning the dense legal text for the name of the ruthless private equity firm that had just seized her multi-million-dollar home. Her eyes locked onto the creditor information block at the bottom of the page. Her breathing completely stopped. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering to the floor to land right next to a pool of spilled champagne. Richard bent down slowly, his knees popping in the quiet room. He picked up the paper and read the name printed under the sole legal creditor. It did not list a massive, faceless Wall Street conglomerate. It did not list a major national bank. It listed my exact full legal name, followed by the private wealth holding company I personally controlled. The devastating truth crashed over them with the terrifying force of a tidal wave. I had not surrendered to their pathetic social media blackmail. I had not paid off the bank to save their reputation out of familial guilt. I had used my own immense financial leverage to buy their toxic debt at a massive discount, stepping perfectly into the shoes of their private lenders. I did not just report their identity theft to the federal government to get Chelsea arrested. I legally bought the very roof over their heads. I was the one foreclosing on their sanctuary. I was the one permanently evicting them. Chelsea, currently being hauled toward the front door by the federal agents, caught a glimpse of the foreclosure documents in our father's shaking hands. "What is it?" she screamed, fighting uselessly against the steel handcuffs. "What did Sydney do to us?" Richard could not even speak. He just stared at the piece of paper, his entire carefully constructed universe collapsing into absolute dust. He had threatened to kick me out of the family and remove me from his will if I did not pay for Chelsea's crimes. Now he was standing in a house he no longer legally owned, watching his golden child being dragged away to a federal holding cell, while his own retirement and shelter were legally controlled by the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating like garbage. The Grand Lake Forest estate, the ultimate symbol of their arrogant, toxic pride, now belonged exclusively to me. They had literally bet their entire lives on a lie, and I had just arrived to collect their absolute, irreversible ruin. Miles away from the screaming and the flashing red and blue emergency lights of the suburban raid, my downtown penthouse was a sanctuary of absolute silence. I stood in my kitchen, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering an uninterrupted view of the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. The city lights of Chicago glittered below me like a sprawling grid of diamonds. I walked over to the custom bar cart and picked up a heavy crystal glass. I reached for a bottle of aged Kentucky bourbon, the kind of rare vintage you only open to celebrate a monumental corporate closing. I poured a generous measure, listening to the rich amber liquid hit the crystal with a satisfying splash. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest. It tasted like absolute, undeniable victory. I walked over to the marble kitchen island and set my glass down next to my personal cell phone. The screen was completely dark for exactly 3 minutes. Then the digital assault began. The phone vibrated violently against the cold stone surface, the harsh, buzzing sound shattering the quiet elegance of my apartment. I did not reach for it. I just leaned against the counter, crossed my arms, and watched the notifications roll in. The escalation happened exactly as I had predicted, fueled by their blind rage and their habitual need to control my life. The first barrage of messages came directly from my father. His texts were written in all capital letters, radiating the exact same toxic arrogance he had displayed at the dining room table. He demanded that I answer the phone immediately. He called me an ungrateful brat and ordered me to call the commercial bank to fix whatever administrative glitch had just frozen his accounts. My mother chimed in seconds later, her texts echoing his furious entitlement. Linda commanded me to stop playing childish games and warned me that my selfish behavior was ruining their celebratory evening. They genuinely believed this was just a minor banking error. They thought I was throwing a tantrum to prove a point. They had absolutely no idea that the federal government was already marching up their pristine driveway with a battering ram. I took another slow sip of my bourbon as the tone of the notifications drastically shifted. 10 minutes passed. The angry demands abruptly stopped, instantly replaced by a sudden chaotic flood of pure panic. The phone began ringing incessantly, back-to-back calls that I simply let bounce directly to my automated voicemail. My mother sent an urgent voice memo, her digital transcription popping up on my locked screen. The text read that federal agents had just kicked the front door wide open. She was screaming in the background of the audio file, begging me to call my corporate lawyers and use my wealth management connections to save them from the raid. Jason tried to call me twice, from what I assumed were his final moments of freedom, before being physically thrown against his own mahogany wet bar. Chelsea sent a frantic, heavily misspelled text message. She typed that armed agents were putting steel handcuffs on her wrists and physically dragging her out of the house. She begged me to wire federal bail money immediately, crying that she could not go to a government holding cell because she had a highly sensitive skin condition. The sheer delusion was almost comedic to witness. Even while being actively arrested for a massive financial felony, my golden child sister was primarily worried about her luxury skincare routine. The notifications began multiplying exponentially as the reality of the situation leaked out to the rest of the family. Aunts and uncles, the exact same flying monkeys who had publicly humiliated me on social media just hours ago, were now flooding my inbox. They had clearly received panicked phone calls from Linda as she watched her empire crumble. Their hateful, aggressive messages from yesterday vanished into thin air, instantly replaced by desperate pleas for me to intervene. My uncle, the man who had left a voicemail stating he was ashamed to share my last name, now texted to ask if I could use my elite financial network to post a federal bond for Chelsea. Another aunt sent a massive paragraph apologizing for her previous social media comments, swearing she never knew the truth about the Ponzi scheme and begging me to show mercy to my mother. It was a spectacular, pathetic display of hypocrisy. They were only apologizing because they realized I held the ultimate power. And they were utterly terrified of being caught in the federal crossfire. By the end of the second hour, the phone had registered exactly 66 missed calls. The glowing screen was a chaotic waterfall of digital desperation. But the final series of messages from my father were the ones that truly confirmed my absolute triumph. Richard had finally read the foreclosure documents handed to him by the process server. He had finally seen my full legal name listed as the sole creditor and owner of his multi-million-dollar estate. His final texts were entirely stripped of his usual country club pride. The overwhelming arrogance was completely gone, pulverized by the brutal reality of his financial execution. He typed that the agents were seizing their luxury vehicles and that they were officially losing the house. He wrote that the process server had legally given them 30 days to vacate the premises before the sheriff arrived to change the locks. He pleaded with me, begging me to remember that they were my parents. Linda sent a final, desperate message, promising that they would sign any contract I wanted, swearing that they loved me, and crying that they had absolutely nothing left to their names. I stood alone in my penthouse, surrounded by the quiet, untouchable luxury I had built from absolute scratch. I looked at the screen displaying their complete and utter devastation. I felt no guilt. I felt no remorse. I felt no lingering obligation to the people who had gladly offered me up as a sacrificial lamb to protect a criminal. They had demanded I surrender my career, my licenses, and my entire life to save theirs. Now they were begging on their knees for mercy from the exact same daughter they had tried to destroy. I picked up the phone, the glass screen cool against my fingers. I did not type a long explanation. I did not gloat or offer them a single ounce of closure. I opened the group chat containing Richard, Linda, and Chelsea. I slowly tapped out exactly 2 words. Too late. I hit send, locked the screen, and placed the phone face down on the marble counter. I picked up my glass of bourbon and turned back to watch the beautiful glittering skyline of my city. The war was officially over and I had won. The glowing screen of my personal cell phone illuminated the dark marble surface of my kitchen island, casting a harsh artificial light against the pristine stone. I stood perfectly still, watching the digital display completely flood with a fresh, desperate wave of notifications. The initial shock of the federal raid had clearly worn off, for my parents rapidly replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of their new reality. The group chat I had ignored was no longer sufficient for my mother. Linda needed a direct, uninterrupted line to her oldest daughter. Her contact photo, a heavily filtered, professionally captured image from a country club charity gala last spring, flashed aggressively on the screen. I did not answer the incoming call. I simply let it ring, listening to the sharp, rhythmic vibration drill against the countertop. The call disconnected automatically, rolling over into my voicemail system. 5 seconds later, a massive, frantic text message materialized on the screen. I picked up the device, the cool metal casing feeling solid and grounding in my palm. I unlocked the screen and opened the direct message thread with Linda. The paragraph she had just typed was a frantic, breathless stream of consciousness, entirely devoid of her usual refined suburban punctuation. "Sydney, please." The text message began, the desperation practically bleeding through the digital pixels. "The agents are putting steel handcuffs on Chelsea. They are physically forcing her into the back of a government vehicle. They are putting yellow federal seizure tape across the front doors of our house. The process server told us we have 30 days before the sheriff throws us out onto the street. You have to call your corporate lawyers right now. You proved your point. We are so incredibly sorry for what we said on Friday. Just call the bank and make this stop. We are your family. You are my daughter. Please save us." I read the message twice, my face remaining an absolute impenetrable mask of calm. I analyzed her words not as a daughter, but as a highly trained financial executive evaluating a bankrupt asset. Linda was not apologizing for committing federal identity theft. She was not apologizing for forging my signature to secure a $250,000 commercial loan. She was not expressing a single ounce of genuine remorse for prioritizing a massive financial fraud over my career and my professional licenses. She was only apologizing because she had been caught. She was only begging because the federal government had just physically ripped her golden child out of her arms and handed her an eviction notice. My mind instantly flashed back to the dining room table just a few short days ago. I vividly remembered the cold, malicious satisfaction in my mother's eyes when she threw that bank statement at me. I remembered her standing shoulder to shoulder with Richard, boldly declaring that if I did not empty my investment accounts to pay off Chelsea's catastrophic debt, I would be permanently erased from their lives. I remembered her screaming that I was a cold, calculating machine who would die completely alone. They had demanded that I step out of the family. They had drawn a hard, unforgiving line in the sand, fully expecting me to crawl back on my hands and knees with a cashier's check in my teeth. They wanted to discard me the exact second I refused to be their financial sacrificial lamb. I stared down at the blinking cursor on my phone screen. I did not type out a long, emotional paragraph. I did not explain the meticulous legal precision of how I had purchased their mezzanine debt at a massive discount. I did not gloat about the federal whistleblower forms I had personally submitted to the Internal Revenue Service. They did not deserve an explanation, and they certainly did not deserve the satisfaction of knowing they had drawn any emotional reaction out of me. I slowly typed the letter T, then O, then O. I hit the spacebar. I typed L, then A, then T, then E. I added a single definitive period at the end of the phrase. I pressed send. I watched the tiny blue speech bubble appear on the screen. I waited exactly 3 seconds. The small gray text indicating that the message had been delivered instantly changed to read, Linda was staring at her screen, watching her entire world burn to the ground, and those two words were the absolute final nail in her coffin. I did not wait for her to start typing a response. I immediately tapped the information icon at the top of the message thread. I scrolled down past her contact details, my finger hovering over the bright red text at the very bottom of the screen. Block this caller. I pressed it. A confirmation prompt popped up, warning me that I would no longer receive phone calls, messages, or FaceTime requests from people on my block list. I confirmed the action without a single heartbeat of hesitation. Linda was gone. I navigated back to my primary contact list. I found Richard's profile. I pressed the red text. Block this caller. Confirmed. I found Chelsea's profile. Block this caller. Confirmed. I found Jason's profile. Block this caller. Confirmed. I did not stop there. I methodically opened my call log and text message history. I found the phone number of the aunt who had texted me yesterday, calling me a sociopathic monster. Blocked. I found the uncle who had left the scathing voicemail, hoping my wealth would rot in my hands. Blocked. I went through every single extended relative, family friend, and country club acquaintance who had acted as a flying monkey for my mother's digital witch hunt. I systematically severed every single digital tie to my toxic bloodline. With every single contact, I blocked the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for 33 years, grew lighter. The constant gnawing anxiety of trying to navigate their impossible expectations simply evaporated. The fear of their judgment, the dread of their holiday dinners, the absolute exhaustion of being the family scapegoat, it was all completely gone. I locked my phone, the screen turning pitch black. I placed the device face down on the marble kitchen island. The silence that followed was not empty. It was profound. It was the rich, heavy silence of total, undisputed victory. My penthouse was a fortress high above the chaotic, scrambling desperation of the people who had tried to destroy me. I picked up my heavy crystal glass, the ice clinking softly against the sides. I walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, illuminated grid of downtown Chicago. The headlights of thousands of cars streamed along Lakeshore Drive like ribbons of liquid gold. The city was alive, vibrating with power and endless ambition. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the aged Kentucky bourbon. The dark liquor burned pleasantly down my throat, settling into a deep, comforting warmth in my stomach. I stood there savoring the absolute perfection of the moment. I had not raised my voice. I had not thrown a tantrum. I had not allowed them to drag me down into their emotional mud. I had simply used the brutal, uncompromising reality of the federal justice system and the aggressive mechanics of corporate capitalism to entirely obliterate my enemies. I was 33 years old. I was a senior director at one of the most prestigious wealth management funds in the country. I had a flawless professional reputation, a massive personal fortune, and I literally held the legal deed to the estate where my abusers used to sleep. I took another sip of my bourbon, staring out at the empire I had conquered, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely, unapologetically free. 2 months passed with the cold mechanical precision of a ticking clock. The autumn leaves had long since withered, replaced by the gray, unforgiving slush of a Chicago January. I stood before the full-length mirror in my penthouse, adjusting the lapels of a charcoal gray Armani suit that felt more like a suit of armor than clothing. I looked at the woman staring back at me. Her eyes were sharp, her posture was unyielding, and her expression was a study in clinical indifference. Today was not about family. Today was about the final disposal of bankrupt assets. The Dirksen Federal Building loomed over the city like a monument to gravity and consequence. As I stepped out of my black car, the wind whipped around the steel structures, but I did not feel the chill. I walked through the security scanners and into the hushed, high-ceilinged hallways, where the United States government dismantled lives one file at a time. David walked beside me, his leather briefcase containing the final nail for the coffin I had spent 2 months building. The courtroom was a cavern of dark wood and heavy silence. I took my seat in the front row of the gallery, maintaining a gaze that never once wavered toward the defense table. I did not need to look to know they were there. I could feel the radiation of their desperation. Chelsea sat huddled next to her high-priced defense attorney, her designer labels replaced by a drab conservative sweater that could not hide the fact that she had lost significant weight. She looked like a ghost of the vibrant, arrogant influencer who had tried to extort me. My parents, Richard and Linda, sat directly behind her. They looked like they had aged 20 years in 8 weeks. The country club tan had faded into a sickly, sallow paleness. Richard's expensive blazer hung loose on his diminished frame, and Linda's hands shook so violently she had to keep them buried in her lap. They were no longer the pillars of Lake Forest society. They were accessories to a federal crime waiting for the floor to drop away. When the bailiff called my name to the witness stand, the room seemed to contract. I walked to the front, raised my right hand, and swore the oath without a tremor in my voice. I took my seat and looked directly at the assistant U.S. attorney. For the next 2 hours, I dismantled my sister's existence with the same cold efficiency I used to manage a $100 million hedge fund. I did not talk about hurt feelings. I did not talk about the years of being the family scapegoat. I presented the federal prosecutors with a systematic roadmap of their betrayal. I testified about the day I discovered the $250,000 commercial loan attached to my Social Security number. I explained the forensic trail of circular wire transfers Jason had used to launder stolen investor funds. I authenticated the recordings of Jason attempting to blackmail me in the parking garage, and the digital logs showing how my parents had accessed my private files to forge my signature. Every word I spoke was backed by a document. Every accusation was verified by a digital timestamp. I watched the judge's face harden as the evidence of systematic identity theft and wire fraud piled up on the bench. I was not a sister or a daughter in that moment. I was the primary witness for the prosecution, and I was providing the state with everything it needed to bury them. When I stepped down from the stand, I walked past the defense table. Chelsea finally caught my eye, her face contorting into a silent, pleading mask of terror. I felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just the completion of a necessary transaction. The sentencing was swift and brutal. The judge did not hold back, citing the calculated nature of the fraud and the total lack of remorse displayed during the initial investigation. For the crime of federal wire fraud and interstate conspiracy, Chelsea was sentenced to 48 months in a federal correctional facility. 4 years. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. Chelsea let out a sharp, choked wail before being led away by federal marshals. She looked back at our parents, but they were too busy staring at the floor to offer her any comfort. But the collapse was not limited to Chelsea. Karma had a secondary strike prepared for the man who thought he could jump ship before it sank. As the marshals led Chelsea through the back door, David leaned over and whispered the news he had just received from the clerk. Jason, the financial architect of the Ponzi scheme, had filed for an emergency divorce from Chelsea only 48 hours after the raid. He had attempted to distance himself from her criminal liability, hoping to protect the few shell companies he thought I hadn't found. His cowardice, however, had backfired spectacularly. By filing for divorce and attempting to move assets, he had triggered an automatic deep-dive audit by the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had been watching his move. They did not care about his marriage. They cared about the millions of dollars in undeclared income they found hidden in his Delaware shell accounts. Jason was currently being processed in a separate room, facing a mountain of federal tax evasion charges that would likely keep him behind bars long after Chelsea was released. The rat had tried to flee the trap, only to walk directly into the jaws of the taxman. Finally, I turned my attention to the 2 people who had started this war at a dinner table in November. Richard and Linda stood in the back of the courtroom, looking lost in a building that did not care about their status. David handed me a final set of papers to sign. Because they had leveraged their entire life savings and their estate to fund Chelsea's fraud, and because I now legally owned their primary debt, they were officially out of options. That morning, my parents had been forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Their assets were being liquidated to satisfy their creditors, and I was the largest creditor on the list. The Lake Forest mansion, the ultimate symbol of their arrogant pride, was officially under a foreclosure judgment. As I walked out of the courtroom and into the bright, freezing sunlight of the plaza, I saw the digital notification on my phone. A real estate crew was currently driving up their pristine driveway to plant a massive auction and foreclosure sign on the front lawn. I stood on the steps of the federal building watching the busy Chicago traffic. My parents were homeless. My sister was a federal inmate. My brother-in-law was a target of the IRS. They had tried to steal my life to fund a fantasy, and in return I had given them the absolute reality of their own ruin. I adjusted my suit, signaled for my driver, and stepped into the car. I had exactly 1,000 words to say to them, but I had already sent them the only two that mattered. I was 33 years old, and for the first time my future was entirely my own. The heavy bronze doors of the federal courthouse swung shut behind me, sealing the fate of my former sister and officially concluding the criminal phase of my family's destruction. I stepped out onto the expansive concrete plaza, the brutal Chicago winter wind immediately whipping against my charcoal gray suit. Beside me, David walked with the quiet, satisfied stride of a corporate litigator who had just orchestrated a flawless execution. My black town car was idling at the edge of the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the bleak, overcast sky. I felt a profound sense of emptiness, but it was not the hollow ache of grief. It was the vast, pristine emptiness of a freshly cleared battlefield. I had methodically sterilized my life of toxic liabilities, and the air entering my lungs had never tasted so remarkably clean. I was barely 50 feet from the waiting vehicle when two figures detached themselves from the shadow of a concrete pillar and stepped directly into my path. I stopped my posture instantly, locking into a stance of absolute authority. Richard and Linda stood blocking the sidewalk. If I had not known them for 33 years, I might have walked right past them. The arrogant, status-obsessed suburbanites from Lake Forest had been completely eradicated. Richard was wearing a wool coat that looked entirely too large for his rapidly shrinking frame. His shoulders were slumped, his face was unshaven, and the aggressive spark that used to define his eyes had been completely extinguished. Linda looked even worse. Her previously immaculate blonde hair was flat and visibly thinning. She was wearing a mismatched scarf over a wrinkled sweater, her hands trembling violently in the freezing wind. They looked exactly like what they were. Two bankrupt accomplices who had bet their entire existence on a massive lie and lost absolutely everything. "Sydney, please wait." Richard choked out, raising a shaking hand as if to physically stop me from taking another step. His voice lacked any trace of the booming, commanding tone he used when he ordered me to empty my bank accounts at the dining room table 2 months ago. It was a thin, fragile rasp. "Please just give us 5 minutes. We have absolutely nowhere else to go." I did not flinch. I did not look at David for intervention. I simply stared at the two strangers standing on the concrete pavement. "You have exactly 60 seconds before my driver calls courthouse security," I stated, my voice cutting through the wind with lethal precision. Linda suddenly lunged forward, falling to her knees right there on the freezing, dirty pavement of the Federal Plaza. She reached out and desperately grabbed the hem of my tailored trousers. "Sydney, I am begging you," Linda sobbed, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure desperation. "We have absolutely nothing left. The bank locked the doors to the house this morning. The federal agents seized our retirement accounts. We cannot even afford the security deposit for a cheap motel room. We are going to be sleeping in the streets tonight. Please, you have to drop the civil lawsuit against us. If you just release the civil hold on our secondary checking account, we can at least rent a small apartment. You already sent Chelsea to a federal prison. You already took the house. You proved your point. Please show us some mercy. We are your parents." I looked down at the woman gripping my pant leg. I looked at the man standing behind her, weeping silently into his hands. They were attempting to use the very concept of family that they had weaponized against me my entire life. They wanted mercy from the daughter they had gladly offered up as a financial sacrifice. They expected the woman whose identity they had stolen to reach into her pocket and fund their survival. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual obligation. I analyzed their weeping forms with the exact same clinical detachment I used to evaluate a liquidated corporate asset. My entire career as a private wealth manager was built on calculating risk, and engaging with these two individuals represented a catastrophic loss of equity. I calmly reached down and peeled Linda's freezing fingers off my trousers, stepping back to ensure there was a clear, undeniable physical boundary between us. You do not get to invoke the word family to save yourselves from the consequences of your own felonies, I said, my voice echoing sharply across the concrete plaza. 2 months ago, you stood in your formal dining room and gave me a direct ultimatum. You looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I did not wire $750,000 to cover your criminal activities, I would be permanently kicked out of this family. You promised to erase me from your lives. You told me I was dead to you. Richard let out a broken, pathetic sob, shaking his head frantically. We did not mean it, he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. We were just desperate. We were terrified. We love you, Sydney. I did not blink. I did not let a single ounce of their manipulation penetrate my armor. I delivered my final verdict with the chilling mechanical accuracy of a judge reading a death sentence. You said I was kicked out of the family, I stated, maintaining absolute unwavering eye contact with both of them. I am simply living up to the exact status you assigned me. I am a stranger, and strangers do not pay for your housing. Strangers do not drop civil lawsuits against thieves. Do not ever bother strangers again. I turned my back on them for the final time. I walked the remaining 20 feet to the idling black car. The driver immediately opened the heavy armored rear door for me. I stepped into the warm, pristine leather interior, and David slid into the seat right beside me. The heavy door slammed shut instantly, silencing the sounds of the freezing wind and the pathetic wailing coming from the pavement outside. As the luxury vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, I looked out the dark-tinted window. I watched Richard and Linda collapse completely onto the cold concrete of the Federal Plaza. They were holding on to each other, weeping uncontrollably, as the reality of their absolute destitution finally crushed them into dust. They had demanded that I step out of their family, and I had happily obliged, taking their entire financial empire with me. I turned away from the window, picked up my tablet, and began reviewing the upcoming quarterly projections for my $50 million portfolio. The past was entirely dead, and my bright, lucrative future was waiting. 6 months after the heavy bronze doors of the federal courthouse closed behind me, a completely different set of doors swung open to welcome my new reality. The massive frosted glass doors of my newly renovated corner office glided apart silently. The polished brass plaque bolted firmly to the center of the rich mahogany wall read, "Sydney Managing Director." I walked slowly across the plush, sound-absorbing carpet of the executive suite, running my hand along the smooth edge of my custom-built desk. The floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire room, offering a panoramic, breathtaking view of the iconic Chicago skyline and the vast, glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. I stood there in the quiet morning light, looking down at the bustling financial district that I had absolutely conquered. The air in this room was completely still, entirely free of the suffocating toxic tension that used to define my daily existence. I had climbed to the absolute pinnacle of the private wealth management sector, and I had done it by completely severing the dead weight of my biological family. The final piece of their financial ruin had concluded precisely 3 weeks ago in a sterile municipal auction room. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate in Lake Forest, the ultimate monument to my parents' arrogant pride and fraudulent lifestyle, had been auctioned off to the highest corporate bidder. Because I was the primary secured creditor holding the defaulted mezzanine debt, the massive proceeds from the sale flowed directly and legally into my private holding company. I recovered every single cent of the capital I had strategically deployed to trap them, plus a substantial legally mandated amount of default interest. Richard and Linda had watched from a distance as real estate developers bid on their custom kitchen and their imported marble foyer. They were currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. surviving entirely on whatever meager Social Security checks the federal government allowed them to keep after the heavy penalties. Chelsea was currently serving her second month in a federal correctional facility in Minnesota, entirely stripped of her luxury skincare and her fake internet followers. Jason was drowning in relentless tax evasion hearings fighting a losing battle against the government. They were completely legally and permanently erased from my daily reality. I did not keep the auction profits for myself. My own investment portfolios were already generating exponential wealth, and I had absolutely zero desire to build my personal empire on the dirty, tainted foundation of their seized assets. Instead, I instructed David and my corporate legal team to establish a highly structured, irrevocable, philanthropic trust. I took the entire net profit from the sale of the Lake Forest estate and funded a perpetual scholarship program. The charter of the fund was incredibly specific and intentionally ruthless in its criteria. It was designed exclusively to provide full tuition housing and living stipends to working-class independent college students who were entirely estranged from their families and completely self-reliant. I wanted to actively fund the exact type of young, desperate, and fiercely ambitious woman I had been 10 years ago. I wanted to ensure that no brilliant student ever had to work a grueling double shift at a greasy diner just to buy financial textbooks, while their parents bought luxury cars for a golden child. I used the ashes of my parents' fake empire to pave a golden road for the very people they would have casually looked down upon. My office door opened softly, and David walked in holding a crystal glass of sparkling water and a thick leather binder. He was closely followed by Jonathan Caldwell, the senior managing partner who had completely backed my play against my father's corporate sabotage attempt. They did not look at me with the jealousy, manipulation, or conditional love that had poisoned my entire childhood. They looked at me with absolute, undeniable professional respect. They saw a woman who possessed the clinical ruthlessness to protect her assets against federal identity theft, and the brilliant financial acumen to generate massive capital for the firm. We sat down at the circular glass conference table in my office to discuss a new billion-dollar acquisition strategy for the upcoming fiscal quarter. There were no snide comments about my marital status. There were no passive-aggressive jabs about my lack of children or my dedication to my career. There were no impossible demands, no forged signatures, and no unhinged theatrical performances. The men sitting at my table were the family I had actively chosen. They were a family forged by mutual respect, shared ambition, and ironclad loyalty. They valued my intellect, they rewarded my hard work, and they never once asked me to set myself on fire to keep their illusions warm. I looked around the bright, sunlit boardroom, and a profound wave of absolute tranquility washed over me. The upcoming holiday season was rapidly approaching, but for the first time in 33 years, my calendar was completely clear of toxic obligations. I would not be driving to the suburbs to sit at a hostile dining table and be treated like a walking automated teller machine. I would not be forced to smile and nod while my mother paraded a criminal around like a prized trophy. I would be spending Thanksgiving on a private beach in the Maldives, completely unreachable by phone or email, sipping vintage champagne and enjoying the absolute silence of my flawless victory. People often claim that blood is thicker than water. They use the concept of family as a permanent, unbreakable chain designed to keep you tethered to a sinking ship. They expect you to absorb their financial failures and swallow their psychological abuse simply because you share the same last name. But I had proven that the chain could be shattered with a single calculated strike. I had proven that when you strip away the guilt and the emotional manipulation, toxic relatives are nothing more than bad investments. I had executed the ultimate corporate restructuring of my own life. I had identified the massive liabilities, seized the underlying assets, and liquidated the threats with extreme, unapologetic prejudice. I turned my attention back to the massive window, watching the bright morning sun rise high over the towering skyscrapers of Chicago. The sky was a brilliant, unblemished blue, stretching out endlessly over the water. I took a deep, steadying breath of the crisp, filtered air. The financial empire was entirely mine, the painful past was completely dead, and the brilliant dawn of my absolute freedom had finally arrived. The most profound lesson we can extract from this journey is that shared DNA does not automatically grant someone a lifelong pass to your peace of mind, your resources, or your future. Society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred obligation that requires us to endure endless manipulation, financial exploitation, and psychological abuse simply because we happen to share the same last name. However, true loyalty should never require you to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. When people who are supposed to protect and nurture you actively choose to weaponize your hard work to fund their own delusions, they cease being family, they become destructive liabilities. Establishing firm, unapologetic boundaries is not an act of cruelty or selfishness. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and profound self-respect. You are entirely allowed to walk away from a table where basic human respect is no longer being served. You do not owe your hard-earned success, your professional reputation, or your mental health to individuals who actively root for your downfall while simultaneously demanding unlimited access to your bank accounts. Sometimes the most empowering and necessary decision you can make in your adult life is to treat toxic relationships exactly like bad corporate investments and liquidate them completely. Authentic healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. You have the absolute undeniable right to construct your own chosen family built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, shared ambition, and genuine support. Your true worth is never determined by the people who tried to use or destroy you. It is determined by the beautiful, unbreakable empire you choose to build from the ashes they left behind. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your own peace, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more empowering content.